The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Silver Creek Saloon, and Penelope Ashworth stepped down into the dusty street of Columbia, California, clutching a letter that had traveled 3,000 miles just to break her heart. It was June of 1872, and the town sprawled before her like something from a dream she had never quite imagined. All wooden storefronts and boardwalks, the Sierra Nevada foothills rising in the distance under a brilliant blue sky. The air smelled of pine and dust and horses, nothing like the salt tang of Boston Harbor she had left behind 6 weeks ago. She stood there for a moment, her traveling dress wrinkled and stained from the journey, the envelope in her gloved hand growing damp from the sweat of her palms, despite the relatively mild mountain air. The letter had arrived just as she was boarding the train in Boston. Her cousin Margaret had pressed it into her hands with wide, apologetic eyes, and Penelope had read it standing on the platform as the conductor called for passengers to board. The words were still burned into her memory, each one a small knife wound that refused to heal. Dear Miss Ashworth, it is with regret that I must inform you that my circumstances have changed since our correspondence began. I have recently become engaged to Miss Elizabeth Thornton of San Francisco, whose family connections will prove advantageous to my business prospects. I trust you will understand that a woman of your station would find California unsuitable. I have enclosed funds for your return journey. Regards, Theodore Walsh. She had boarded the train anyway, too proud and too stubborn to turn back. The money he had sent remained in her reticule, untouched. She would rather starve than use a single cent of his gilt offering. Now, standing in the middle of Columbia with the stagecoach already pulling away and her 2 small trunks sitting in the dirt beside her, Penelope realized that pride was a cold companion when you were alone in a strange town with nowhere to go. She had spent most of her savings on the journey west, counting on Theodore's promises of marriage and a home. The little that remained would last perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. A man emerged from the saloon, and Penelope's breath caught despite herself. He was tall, probably over 6 feet, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of dark honey that curled slightly at his collar. He wore dusty denim trousers, a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A hat hung down his back by a cord around his neck, and his boots were scuffed and well-worn. But it was his face that held her attention, all sharp angles and strong lines, with eyes the color of warm amber that seemed to take in everything at once. He noticed her staring and touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a casual salute, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly looked away, pretending sudden interest in the general store across the street. "You look lost, miss." His voice was deeper than she had expected, with a slight drawl that marked him as someone who had spent his life out here in the West. "I am perfectly fine, thank you," Penelope said, lifting her chin in what she hoped was a confident manner. The effect was somewhat diminished when a gust of wind sent her hat tilting sideways and loosened several pins from her dark hair. The cowboy stepped closer, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. "Those trunks yours?" "Yes. You got somewhere to take them?" Penelope opened her mouth to lie, to tell this stranger that, of course, she had accommodations arranged, but something in his steady gaze made the words die in her throat. She looked down at the letter still clutched in her hand, at Theodore's elegant script that had once made her heart flutter with anticipation, and felt tears prick at her eyes. "No," she said quietly. "I do not." The cowboy followed her gaze to the letter, and something shifted in his expression. Without asking permission, he reached out and gently took it from her fingers. Penelope was too surprised to protest as he unfolded it and read, his jaw tightening with each line. "This the reason you came west?" he asked when he finished. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, those amber eyes seeming to see straight through to her soul, and then did something Penelope never could have predicted. He tore the letter in half, then in quarters, then kept tearing until it was nothing but scraps of paper that he let fall from his fingers to scatter in the dust at their feet. "What are you doing?" Penelope gasped, staring at the pieces of her only proof that Theodore Walsh had ever existed, had ever written to her with promises of love. "Saving you from reading it again," the cowboy said. He pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket, along with a stub of pencil, and began to write, his hand moving quickly across the page. When he finished, he tore the page out and held it toward her. "Here." Penelope took it with trembling fingers and read the words scrawled there in handwriting that was rough but earnest. "I promise Miss Penelope Ashworth a place to stay for as long as she needs it. No expectations, no obligations, just a chance to figure out what comes next. Signed, Caleb Vance." She stared at the paper, then at the man who had written it, trying to make sense of what was happening. "You do not even know me." "I know you came 3,000 miles on a promise that got broken," Caleb said. "I know you are standing here with everything you own and nowhere to go. And I know my sister runs a boarding house 2 streets over that has a room free. That is all I need to know right now. Why would you help me?" He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the scattered pieces of Theodore's letter. "Because somebody should have helped my mother when she needed it, back when I was too young to do it myself. She came west on promises too, and they got broken just the same. Maybe if someone had been kind to her, things would have turned out different." There was old pain in his voice, buried deep, but still sharp around the edges. Penelope felt something in her chest loosen, some tight knot of fear and uncertainty beginning to unravel. She looked at the promise he had written, at his name signed at the bottom in letters that slanted slightly to the right, and made a decision that would change everything. "All right," she said. "I accept your help, Mr. Vance, thank you." A smile transformed his face, making him look younger and somehow more approachable. "Call me Caleb. Mr. Vance was my father, and he is not someone I care to be reminded of." He bent and picked up both her trunks as though they weighed nothing, hoisting one under each arm. "Come on. Sarah is going to want to meet you." Penelope followed him down the dusty street, her traveling skirts kicking up small clouds with each step. People stared as they passed, curious about the stranger in their midst, but Caleb just nodded to those he knew and kept walking. The boarding house turned out to be a 2-story structure with fresh white paint and blue shutters, a front porch with rocking chairs, and window boxes overflowing with bright flowers. A woman emerged as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 30, with the same honey-colored hair as Caleb and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "Caleb, what have you brought me this time? Last week it was a stray dog, and the week before that a broken wagon wheel you swore you could fix." "This is Miss Penelope Ashworth," Caleb said, setting the trunks down on the porch. "She needs a room." Sarah's smile faded as she took in Penelope's exhausted face and wrinkled traveling clothes, the dust of a long journey still clinging to her hem. Her gaze sharpened with understanding. "Of course. Come in, dear. You look like you could use some tea and a wash." "I can pay," Penelope said quickly, not wanting charity. "I have some money and I can work. I am a good seamstress and I can read and write and do sums." "We will figure all that out later," Sarah said, waving a hand dismissively. "Right now you need to rest. Caleb, bring those trunks up to the blue room." The blue room turned out to be a small but cheerful space on the 2nd floor, with a window that looked out over the street and a bed with a quilt in shades of blue and white. There was a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a small wardrobe, and a rocking chair in the corner. It was simple and clean and more welcoming than anywhere Penelope had been in weeks. "I will bring up some hot water," Sarah said. "You take your time settling in." Caleb set the trunks at the foot of the bed and stood there for a moment, his hat in his hands. "I work at the Vance ranch about 5 miles outside town," he said. "It is my place now since my father passed 2 years back. I come into town most Saturdays for supplies, and Sarah usually has a list of things she needs done around here. If you need anything, you let her know and she will let me know." "Thank you," Penelope said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I do not know how I will repay your kindness." "You do not have to repay anything," Caleb said. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "That man who wrote you that letter? He is a fool. I hope you know that." Before Penelope could respond, he was gone, his boots loud on the wooden stairs. She stood there listening to the sound of his departure, then looked down at the promise he had written, still clutched in her hand. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her reticule, then sat down on the bed and finally let herself cry. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment and small kindnesses. Sarah proved to be a generous landlady and an even better friend, sharing meals with Penelope and introducing her to the other boarders. There was Mr. Chen, who ran a laundry service and spoke with a heavy accent but had a smile that could light up a room. There was Mrs. Harriet Bloom, a widow who taught at the schoolhouse and had opinions on everything from politics to pie crust. And there was young Tommy Fletcher, barely 18, who worked at the livery stable and was saving up to buy his own horse. They welcomed Penelope without question, accepting her presence as though she had always been meant to be there. It was so different from Boston, where her parents' deaths had left her dependent on the grudging charity of distant relatives who made it clear she was a burden. Here, nobody seemed to care that she had arrived with nothing but 2 trunks and a broken promise. Caleb came by on Saturday as promised, bringing supplies from his ranch. Penelope watched from the window as he unloaded sacks of flour and sugar, jars of preserves, fresh eggs wrapped carefully in straw. He moved with an easy confidence, his muscles flexing under his shirt as he lifted and carried. When he caught her looking, he waved, and Penelope felt that strange flutter in her chest again, the one she had been trying to ignore all week. "He is a good man," Sarah said, appearing at her elbow. "My brother. Not perfect, mind you. He can be stubborn as a mule and too quick to take responsibility for things that are not his fault, but good through and through." "He barely knows me," Penelope said. "Why did he help me?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching her brother through the window. "Our mother came west with our father when she was just 19. He promised her a home, a family, a good life. What he gave her was heartbreak and hard work and loneliness. When I was 12 and Caleb was 16, she died giving birth to a baby that did not survive. Our father blamed her for it, said she was too weak for this life. Caleb has not forgiven him for that. I do not think he ever will." "I am sorry," Penelope said softly. "It was a long time ago," Sarah said, but her eyes were sad. "Caleb sees our mother in every woman who gets dealt a bad hand. He cannot help himself from trying to make it right. So I am a charity case," Penelope said, trying to keep the bitterness from her voice. "No, dear. You are someone who deserves better than what she got. There is a difference." That afternoon, Sarah asked if Penelope would help with the mending. The boarding house generated a steady supply of torn shirts and loose buttons, and Sarah's eyesight was not what it used to be. Penelope agreed eagerly, grateful for something useful to do. She set up in the parlor with Sarah's sewing basket and worked her way through a pile of clothes, her needle flashing in and out with practiced precision. She was so focused on her work that she did not notice Caleb come in until he spoke. "You are good at that." Penelope looked up to find him leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. He had cleaned up since his morning work, his hair damp and combed back, his shirt fresh. He looked less like a rough cowboy and more like someone she might have met at a church social back in Boston, except for the calluses on his hands and the sun-weathered lines around his eyes. "I have been sewing since I was a child," she said. "My mother taught me. She taught you well." He came into the room and picked up one of the shirts she had already mended, examining her tiny, even stitches. "Mrs. Brennan at the dress shop is always looking for help. I could introduce you if you want. She pays fair wages." "I would like that very much," Penelope said, hope rising in her chest. If she could find steady work, she could pay Sarah proper rent and start saving again. Maybe she could even build a life here, independent and free. "I will take you over there Monday morning," Caleb said. "She is usually in a good mood on Mondays." "You do not have to keep helping me," Penelope said. "You have done more than enough already." "I know I do not have to," Caleb said, meeting her eyes. "I want to." There was something in the way he said it, something warm and sincere that made Penelope's heart beat faster. She looked away, focusing on threading her needle again, trying to ignore the way her hands had started to tremble slightly. "Why?" she asked quietly. Caleb sat down in the chair across from her, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "Can I tell you something? When I read that letter, the one from your Theodore Walsh, I got angry. Not just because he treated you poorly, though that was part of it. I got angry because men like him think they can make promises to people and then break them without consequence. They think the world owes them whatever they want and everyone else should just accept it." "You do not even know him," Penelope said. "I know the type," Caleb said, his voice hard. "My father was the same way. Promised my mother the world, then gave her nothing but grief. I swore when I took over the ranch that I would never be like him. When I make a promise, I keep it. And when I see someone who got hurt by broken promises, I want to help set it right." "Is that all I am to you?" Penelope asked, surprised by the disappointment that washed over her. "A wrong to be righted," Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "At first, maybe. When I saw you standing there with that letter, looking lost and hurt and trying so hard to be brave, I saw my mother. I saw every woman who ever got promised something better and ended up with less. But now," he shook his head slowly, "now I see you, Penelope, and I like what I see." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Penelope felt her breath catch, felt color flood her cheeks. She had been courted before, back in Boston, but it had always felt performative, like everyone was following a script. This was different. This felt real. "I barely know you," she whispered. "Then let me fix that," Caleb said. "Have dinner with me tomorrow. Not here, not with Sarah and the boarders, just you and me. There is a restaurant down by the river that serves the best fried chicken you will ever taste." Penelope knew she should say no. She had just escaped one entanglement with a man who had promised her everything and delivered nothing. It was too soon, too fast, too risky. But when she looked into Caleb's amber eyes, she saw none of Theodore's calculated charm. She saw only honesty and hope and something that might, given time, grow into more. "All right," she said. "Yes, I will have dinner with you." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, brilliant and impossible to look away from. "Tomorrow evening, then, I will pick you up at 6. After he left, Penelope sat there with her sewing forgotten in her lap, wondering what she had just agreed to. Sarah came in a few minutes later and took one look at her face before laughing softly. "He asked you to dinner, did he not? How did you know?" "Because my brother has been circling around the idea all week like a dog around a bone," Sarah said, settling into the chair Caleb had vacated. "I have not seen him this interested in a woman since Mary Lou Thompson tried to catch his eye 3 years ago." What happened with Mary Lou Thompson? She realized Caleb was more interested in his horses than in her, and married the banker instead, Sarah said. "Which worked out well for everyone, I think. She wanted a man who would give her a big house in town and take her to San Francisco twice a year. Caleb would have made her miserable." "What does Caleb want?" Penelope asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Someone real. Someone who sees him for who he is, not who they want him to be. Someone who understands that the ranch comes first, not because he loves it more but because it is a responsibility he takes seriously. And someone who can match his stubbornness with their own, because heaven knows he needs someone who will not just go along with everything he says." "That sounds like a tall order." "Maybe," Sarah said. "Or maybe he just needed to wait for the right person to step off a stagecoach looking lost." Monday morning arrived cool and clear, with fog still clinging to the lower parts of town, when Caleb came to collect Penelope. She had dressed carefully in her best day dress, a deep green cotton that brought out the unusual hazel color of her eyes, and pinned her dark hair up in a simple but neat style. Her hands felt clammy inside her gloves as they walked down Main Street toward the dress shop. Mrs. Brennan turned out to be a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and quick fingers. She looked Penelope up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen every type of person the West had to offer and was not easily impressed. "Caleb says you can sew," she said without preamble. "Yes, madam. I can sew, embroider, and do basic tailoring." "Show me." Mrs. Brennan produced a torn skirt and a needle and thread. Penelope sat down and set to work, aware of both Mrs. Brennan and Caleb watching her. She blocked them out and focused on the fabric, her hands moving with the confidence of long practice. When she finished, she held up the skirt for inspection. Mrs. Brennan examined the repair closely, even turning the fabric inside out to check the stitching. Finally, she nodded. "You will do. I can pay you $2 a week to start, with the possibility of more if business picks up. You will work Tuesday through Saturday, 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, with an hour for lunch. Can you start tomorrow?" "Yes, madam," Penelope said, trying to contain her joy. $2 a week was not much, but it was something. It was independence. Good. Do not be late. Outside, Caleb was grinning. "I told you she would hire you." "Thank you," Penelope said, "for the introduction and for everything else." "You earned that job yourself," Caleb said. "I just opened the door." They walked back toward the boarding house, the morning sun burning off the last of the fog. People were beginning to emerge for the day, shopkeepers opening their doors, the sound of hammering coming from the blacksmith's forge. It all felt wonderfully alive and full of possibility. "Are you still willing to have dinner with me tonight?" Caleb asked as they reached Sarah's porch. "Of course," Penelope said. "Why would I not be? I thought maybe after you got the job, you might not need me anymore," he said. And there was something vulnerable in his voice that made Penelope's heart ache. She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt sleeve. "The job is wonderful and I am grateful for your help, but I am having dinner with you because I want to, not because I need something from you." The relief in his eyes was unmistakable. 6 o'clock then." 6 o'clock, Penelope confirmed. That evening, Caleb arrived exactly on time, cleaned up and wearing what Penelope suspected were his best clothes. They walked through town as the sun began its descent toward the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The restaurant was a simple wooden building on the bank of a creek, with tables set up outside under the trees. They sat at a table near the water, and Caleb ordered the fried chicken he had promised, along with biscuits and greens and sweet tea. The food was delicious, better than anything Penelope had eaten since leaving Boston, but it was the company she enjoyed most. Caleb talked about his ranch, about the horses he raised, and the cattle he ran on the summer pastures up in the hills. He talked about his plans to expand, to maybe start breeding horses seriously instead of just keeping a few around for work. "What about you?" he asked as they finished their meal. "What did you do back in Boston?" "I lived with my aunt and uncle after my parents died," Penelope said. "They were not unkind, but they made it clear I was there on sufferance. I helped my aunt with the household, did sewing for pay when I could. It was not much of a life." "Is that why you agreed to come west when Theodore wrote to you?" "Partly," Penelope admitted. "He painted such a beautiful picture in his letters. A home of our own, a chance to build something new. I think I fell in love with the dream more than the man." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I realize now that I never really knew him at all. We only met twice, both times very briefly, before he left Boston. Everything else was just words on paper." "Words are easy," Caleb said. "Anyone can write pretty things. It is the actions that matter. Like tearing up rejection letters and writing promises to strangers." "Like that," Caleb agreed, a hint of embarrassment coloring his cheeks. They walked back slowly as twilight settled over the town, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. At the boarding house steps, Caleb paused. "I had a good time tonight," he said. "So did I. Can I see you again? Maybe this Sunday? I could show you the ranch." Penelope's first instinct was to say yes immediately, but something made her hesitate. "Caleb, I need to be honest with you. I came here expecting to marry Theodore Walsh. I thought I knew what I wanted, and I was wrong. I do not want to make another mistake by rushing into something before I am ready." "I understand," Caleb said, though disappointment flickered across his face. "You want to take things slow." "I do. Is that all right?" "It is more than all right," Caleb said. "I am not going anywhere, Penelope. Whenever you are ready, I will be here." He tipped his hat to her and walked away into the gathering darkness, and Penelope stood on the porch watching until he disappeared around the corner. Her heart felt full and confused and hopeful all at once, a tangle of emotions she was not sure how to sort out. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Penelope worked at Mrs. Brennan's dress shop, quickly proving her worth with her skilled needle and friendly manner with customers. She paid Sarah proper rent and saved what little was left over. On Sundays, she went to church with the other boarders and then spent the afternoon with Caleb. He courted her patiently, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They went on picnics by the creek, took walks through the hills where he showed her the land he loved, sat on Sarah's porch in the evenings talking about everything and nothing. Slowly, Penelope felt herself relaxing into his presence, the walls she had built around her heart after Theodore's betrayal beginning to crumble. It was different with Caleb. He did not make grand pronouncements or flowery speeches. Instead, he showed her who he was through small actions. He remembered that she liked wildflowers and brought her bunches of them from the meadows near his ranch. He listened when she talked about her parents, about the childhood she had lost when they died, and did not try to fix her sadness with empty platitudes. He made her laugh with stories about his ornery horses and the mishaps that came with ranch life. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, Penelope fell in love. She realized it one Sunday afternoon in late July when they were sitting by the creek, their feet dangling in the cool water. Caleb was talking about a foal that had been born the week before, his face animated with excitement, and Penelope found herself watching him instead of listening. She loved the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way his hands moved when he talked, the way his voice dropped lower when he said something he thought was important. She loved his kindness and his strength and his unwavering certainty about right and wrong. She loved him, and the realization was both terrifying and wonderful. "You are not listening to a word I am saying, are you?" Caleb asked, breaking into her thoughts. "I am sorry," Penelope said, feeling her cheeks heat. "I was distracted." "By what?" "By you." Caleb went very still, his amber eyes searching her face. "Penelope." "I love you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I did not mean to, and I tried not to, but I do. I love you, Caleb Vance." For a moment he just stared at her, and Penelope felt panic beginning to rise. Maybe she had misread everything. Maybe he did not feel the same way. Maybe she had just made a terrible fool of herself. Then Caleb cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough and warm against her skin, and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste, proper kisses she had exchanged with Theodore during their brief courtship. This was fire and need and promise all rolled into one. Caleb kissed her like she was the air he needed to breathe, like he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. And Penelope kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since the day you stepped off that stagecoach looking brave and lost and beautiful. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. I love everything about you, Penelope Ashworth." "Then why did you not say anything?" Penelope asked. "Because you asked me to take things slow and I was trying to be respectful, but I have been in agony waiting for you to be ready." He pulled back enough to look at her properly. "Are you ready now?" "Yes," Penelope said. "I am ready." Caleb kissed her again, slower this time but no less intense. When they finally made their way back to town, walking hand in hand through the warm summer evening, Penelope felt like she was floating. Everything had changed in the space of a few words, and she could not imagine being happier. Sarah took one look at them when they arrived and smiled knowingly. "About time," was all she said, but her eyes were warm with approval. That night, lying in her bed in the blue room, Penelope took out the promise Caleb had written her that first day. The paper was creased and worn from being folded and unfolded so many times, but the words were still clear. She traced his signature with one finger, thinking about how much had changed since that dusty afternoon when she had arrived with nothing but broken dreams. Caleb had promised her a place to stay and a chance to figure out what came next. He had given her so much more than that. He had given her hope and friendship and love. He had given her a future. The next few months were the happiest of Penelope's life. She continued working at the dress shop, where Mrs. Brennan eventually raised her pay to $3 a week after several customers specifically requested Penelope's services for their alterations. She became a fixture in the community, making friends with the other women in town, helping Sarah with the boarding house, attending dances and social events with Caleb at her side. Caleb's ranch prospered that summer, with good rains bringing plenty of grass for the cattle and several of his mares producing strong, healthy foals. He talked more and more about his plans for the future, and increasingly those plans included Penelope. He never formally proposed, but it was understood between them that they were building toward something permanent. In September, as the leaves in the hills began to turn gold and red, Caleb finally made it official. He took Penelope back to the creek where she had first told him she loved him and got down on one knee. "I do not have a fancy ring yet," he said, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "This was my mother's. I know it is not much, but I promise I will get you something better as soon as I can." "It is perfect," Penelope said, tears streaming down her face. "Everything about this is perfect." "Then say yes," Caleb said. Marry me, Penelope, build a life with me. Let me spend every day proving that promises are meant to be kept." "Yes," Penelope said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, yes, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and it fit as though it had been made for her. Then he stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. They were married in October, in the little church at the center of town with what seemed like the entire population of Columbia in attendance. Sarah cried through the whole ceremony, and even Mrs. Brennan dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Penelope wore a dress she had sewn herself, white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and carried a bouquet of the last wildflowers of the season that Caleb had picked that morning. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her thoroughly enough to make several of the older ladies in attendance fan themselves, and Penelope did not care one bit. She was married to the man she loved, surrounded by friends who had become family, in a town that had welcomed her when she had nowhere else to go. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the yard and food provided by seemingly everyone in town. There was music and dancing and more food than Penelope had seen in one place since before her parents died. She danced with Caleb until her feet hurt, then danced some more, dizzy with joy and love and the sheer improbability of how her life had turned out. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Caleb led her to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper. He lifted her into the saddle and swung up behind her, his arms coming around her waist to hold the reins. "Where are we going?" Penelope asked. "Home," Caleb said simply, and urged Copper into a walk. The ranch house was 5 miles outside of town, a sturdy wooden structure that Caleb had built himself after his father died. It was not large or fancy, but it was solid and well-maintained, with a wide porch and windows that looked out over the valley. Caleb had spent the past month fixing it up, painting the walls and mending the roof, and adding small touches that he thought Penelope would like. He carried her over the threshold as tradition demanded, setting her down gently in the main room. There was a fire already burning in the hearth, warmth and light spilling out into the space. Penelope looked around at what was now her home, taking in the rough-hewn furniture and simple decorations, and felt a wave of love so strong it almost knocked her over. "It is not much yet," Caleb said, suddenly sounding uncertain, "but we can fix it up however you like. Add on to it. Make it truly ours." Penelope turned to him and took his hands in hers. "It is perfect because it is ours, because it is real, because you kept your promise." "I will always keep my promises to you," Caleb said seriously. "Always, Penelope, you can count on that." He kissed her then, and she kissed him back, and they did not talk much more that night. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. Penelope had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and hard physical work that came with raising horses and cattle. She learned to cook on a wood stove, to preserve food for the winter, to handle the chickens Caleb bought her so she could have fresh eggs. She learned to ride, first on an old mare named Daisy who was too patient to do anything more than plod along, and eventually on a younger horse with more spirit. Caleb, for his part, learned to share his space and his life with another person after years of living alone. He learned to talk about his feelings instead of bottling them up, to ask for help when he needed it, to compromise on things that did not really matter in the long run. They had arguments, some heated, but they always worked through them because neither was willing to let pride get in the way of love. That winter was harsh, with heavy snows that closed the roads for weeks at a time. Penelope and Caleb spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and simply being together. It was during one of those evenings, wrapped in a quilt with Caleb's arm around her shoulders, that Penelope realized she was pregnant. She told him the next morning over breakfast, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Caleb went very still for a moment, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, and then set it down with a shaking hand. "Truly?" he asked, his voice rough. "Truly," Penelope confirmed. "I think sometime in late summer, if my calculations are right." Caleb stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over, then rounded the table and pulled Penelope into his arms. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to be parents. Are you happy?" Penelope asked, even though the answer was written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Caleb said. "I am terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I can possibly express." He pulled back to look at her, his amber eyes shining with unshed tears. "We are going to do better than our parents did, Penelope. We are going to give this child everything we did not have. Love," Penelope said. "Safety. A home where they know they are wanted." "All of that and more," Caleb agreed. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Penelope suffered from morning sickness for the first few months that made her question whether morning was an accurate term when she spent half the day feeling queasy. Caleb hovered anxiously, trying to anticipate her every need, until Penelope finally had to tell him to stop before she went crazy from the attention. Sarah came out to the ranch frequently to check on her, bringing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and the reassurance that came from someone who had helped deliver half the babies in Colombia over the years. Mrs. Brennan gave Penelope a beautiful handmade cradle as an early baby gift, claiming she had no use for it anymore, and it was just taking up space in her storage room. In August, when the heat hung heavy over the valley and the grass in the pastures had turned golden brown, Penelope went into labor. It was long and difficult and more painful than anything she had ever experienced, but Caleb stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement until his voice was hoarse. Their son was born just before dawn, screaming his displeasure at the world with impressive volume. He was red-faced and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that Penelope swore were already the same amber color as his father's. "What should we name him?" Caleb asked, cradling the baby with the careful reverence of someone holding something infinitely precious and fragile. Penelope had been thinking about this for months. "What was your mother's maiden name, Morrison?" "Why, then Morrison Vance," Penelope said. "After the grandmother he will never get to meet, but who I think would have loved him very much." Caleb's eyes filled with tears. "Morrison Vance," he repeated. "It is perfect." The first few months with a newborn were exhausting in ways Penelope had never imagined. Morrison was a demanding baby, wanting to be held and fed and changed at all hours of the day and night. Penelope stumbled through those early weeks in a haze of sleeplessness, grateful for Caleb's help even though there was not much he could do besides walk the floor with a screaming baby when Penelope needed to rest. But gradually, they found their rhythm. Morrison grew bigger and more alert, his personality beginning to emerge. He had Caleb's stubbornness and Penelope's determination, a combination that promised interesting years ahead. He loved being outside, quieting immediately whenever they took him out onto the porch, his little face turning toward the sun. When Morrison was 6 months old, Sarah brought news that made Penelope's blood run cold. Theodore Walsh was in Colombia. "He arrived yesterday," Sarah said, bouncing Morrison on her hip while Penelope made tea with trembling hands. "Apparently his San Francisco business ventures failed, and his fancy fiancé broke the engagement when he lost his money. He has been asking around about you. What does he want?" Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know, but nothing good would be my guess. He tried to come to the boarding house, but I sent him away with a flea in his ear." Caleb, who had been working in the barn when Sarah arrived, came in to find both women looking worried. "What happened?" "Theodore Walsh is in town," Penelope said, "looking for me." She watched Caleb's expression shift from confusion to understanding to fury in the space of seconds. "The man who rejected you, the same. What does he want?" "I suppose he wants to see if the promises he broke can be mended," Sarah said dryly. "Men like him always think they can charm their way back into a woman's good graces." "He will not get within 10 feet of you," Caleb said, his voice hard. "I promise you that, Penelope." But the next day, Theodore found a way. Penelope was in the vegetable garden behind the house, Morrison sleeping in a basket in the shade nearby, when a voice she recognized made her freeze. "Penelope, you look well." She turned slowly to find Theodore Walsh standing at the edge of her garden, looking significantly worse for wear than she remembered. His clothes were rumpled and dusty, his face thinner, with new lines around his eyes and mouth. He still had that calculated charm in his expression, but it was frayed around the edges now, desperate. "What are you doing here?" Penelope demanded, moving to stand between Theodore and her sleeping son. "I came to find you, to apologize." Theodore stepped closer, and Penelope caught the smell of whiskey on his breath even though it was barely past noon. "I made a terrible mistake, Penelope. I never should have sent you that letter. I have regretted it every day since." "You have regretted losing your rich fiancé and your business prospects," Penelope said coldly. "Do not pretend this is about me." "It is about you," Theodore insisted. "I have thought about you constantly, about the life we could have had together. I was a fool to let you go." "You did not let me go. You rejected me before I even arrived. There is a difference." "I can make it up to you," Theodore said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone that made Penelope's skin crawl. "We can start over. I know I hurt you, but people make mistakes. Surely you can find it in your heart to forgive me." "No," Penelope said firmly. "I cannot and I will not. I have made a life here, Theodore, a good life with a good man who actually keeps his promises. You are not part of it and you never will be." Theodore's expression hardened. "The cowboy Sarah mentioned. Please, Penelope, what kind of future can he give you? You are educated, refined. You deserve better than this rustic life." "I deserve to be loved and respected and valued," Penelope said. "Caleb gives me all of that and more." "You gave me nothing but broken promises and heartache." "I can change," Theodore said desperately. "Just give me a chance to prove it." "No." Penelope crossed her arms over her chest. "You need to leave, Theodore, now." "I am not leaving without you," she said. "Leave." Caleb's voice came from behind Theodore, low and dangerous. Penelope looked past her unwanted visitor to see her husband standing there, his face set in hard lines. "You are on my property without permission. I suggest you get off it before I make you." Theodore spun around, sizing up Caleb with the calculating gaze of someone weighing his chances in a fight. Penelope could have told him it was a losing proposition. Caleb was taller, broader, and made hard from years of physical labor. Theodore, softened by city living and weakened by alcohol, would not stand a chance. "This is between me and Penelope," Theodore said, trying to muster some dignity. "Wrong," Caleb said. "Penelope is my wife. That makes anything concerning her my business. Now leave before I throw you off myself." For a moment, Penelope thought Theodore might actually be foolish enough to try something. But then Morrison woke up and began to cry, and Theodore's gaze shifted to the basket where the baby lay. "You have a child," he said, sounding stunned. "We have a child," Penelope corrected, moving to pick up Morrison. "His name is Morrison, and he is the light of our lives." Something crumpled in Theodore's expression, some last vestige of hope dying. He looked at Penelope holding her baby, at Caleb standing protective and immovable, at the little ranch house and garden that spoke of a life built on love and hard work, and finally seemed to understand that he had lost. "I see," he said quietly. "You have moved on." "I have built a life," Penelope said. "There is a difference." Theodore nodded slowly, then turned and walked away without another word. They watched him go, disappearing down the road toward town, and Penelope felt the tension drain out of her shoulders. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked, coming to put his arm around her. "I am fine," Penelope said, and realized she meant it. Seeing Theodore again had not hurt the way she thought it might. Instead, it had only reinforced how grateful she was for the life she had now. "Actually, I am better than fine. I am happy." "He might come back," Caleb warned. "Then we will deal with it together," Penelope said. "But I do not think he will. He knows there is nothing for him here." She was right. They heard later that day that Theodore had left Columbia on the afternoon stage, heading south toward Los Angeles. Penelope felt nothing but relief at the news, as though a door to her past had finally closed completely. That night, after Morrison was asleep in his cradle and they were lying in bed together, Caleb pulled Penelope close. "I was scared today," he admitted quietly. "When Sarah told us he was here, I was scared you might still have feelings for him." "How could I?" Penelope asked, genuinely confused. "He lied to me, rejected me, and tried to come back only when his other options fell through. What is there to feel except contempt? He was your first love." "No," Penelope said firmly. "He was my first mistake. You are my first and only love, Caleb. You are the one who saw me when I was lost and offered help without expecting anything in return. You are the one who kept every promise you made. You are the one I chose, and I would choose you 1,000 times over." Caleb kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of love. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that choice." "I know you will," Penelope said, "because that is who you are. That is why I love you." The years that followed were full and rich, with all the joys and challenges that came with building a life together. Morrison grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses as much as his father, and had a talent for mischief that kept Penelope on her toes. When he was 3, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again, and this time their daughter Emma was born in the spring, arriving with considerably less drama than her brother. Emma proved to be a quieter child than Morrison, thoughtful and observant, with her mother's dark hair and her father's amber eyes. She followed Penelope everywhere, learning to sew and cook and garden, while Morrison shadowed Caleb, learning about horses and cattle and the rhythms of ranch life. The ranch itself prospered as Caleb's reputation for breeding quality horses spread throughout the region. They expanded the house, adding rooms for the children and a proper parlor for receiving the increasing number of visitors who came to look at Caleb's stock. Penelope continued to sew, though now mostly for her family and friends rather than for pay, and became known for her elaborate quilts that were prized gifts at weddings and births. Sarah remained a constant presence in their lives, doting on her niece and nephew, and serving as both confidante and occasional voice of reason when Penelope and Caleb got too caught up in their plans and schemes. Mrs. Brennan eventually retired and sold her shop to a younger woman from Sacramento, but she stayed in Columbia and became a fixture at Penelope's kitchen table, offering unsolicited advice on everything from child rearing to pie crust. When Morrison was 10 and Emma was 7, Penelope's aunt from Boston wrote with news that she was dying and wished to make amends for the coldness with which she had treated Penelope in her youth. It was a difficult letter to receive, dredging up old hurts that Penelope thought she had left behind. Caleb held her while she cried, then helped her compose a response that was honest but kind, offering forgiveness without pretending the past had not hurt. Her aunt died 3 months later, leaving Penelope a small inheritance that came as a complete surprise. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to make a difference. Penelope and Caleb discussed how to use it for weeks before deciding to invest in more land, expanding the ranch and securing their children's future. The money also allowed them to do something Penelope had been dreaming about for years. They established a fund to help women who arrived in Colombia under circumstances similar to those Penelope had experienced, offering temporary housing and assistance finding work. Sarah administered it through the boarding house, and over the years it helped dozens of women start new lives. "We are paying forward the kindness you showed me," Penelope told Caleb when they made the first distribution of funds, "keeping the promise you made that first day." "It is the right thing to do," Caleb said simply. "No one should have to face what you faced alone." As the children grew older, Penelope and Caleb's love only deepened. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, from harsh winters that killed cattle to illnesses that laid the whole family low, from arguments over money to disagreements about how to raise the children. Through it all, they had remained united, remembering the promises they had made to each other and choosing every day to keep them. Morrison eventually married a girl from town, the daughter of the blacksmith, who was as horse crazy as he was and could shoe a mount faster than most men. They built a house on the far end of the ranch property and began raising their own family, giving Penelope and Caleb grandchildren to spoil and delight in. Emma surprised everyone by developing a talent for numbers and business that rivaled her father's skill with horses. She took over managing the ranch's accounts and sales, freeing Caleb to focus on the breeding program he loved. She married later than her brother, choosing a quiet school teacher who encouraged her ambitions and did not mind that his wife was better at mathematics than he was. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Caleb took Penelope back to the creek where he had first proposed. They were both older now, with gray threading through their hair and lines on their faces earned through years of laughter and hard work. But Caleb looked at Penelope with the same love that had been in his eyes that long ago September day. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, delicate gold set with 3 small sapphires. "I promised you something better than my mother's ring," Caleb said. "It has taken me longer than I intended, but I always keep my promises." "You did not have to do this," Penelope said, tears streaming down her face. "I loved your mother's ring. I know you did, and you still have it, but I wanted to give you something that was just yours, something that represents the life we built together." He slipped the new ring onto her finger, right beside the worn gold band she had never taken off. They sat together in the fading afternoon light, hands clasped, surrounded by wildflowers and the sound of running water, and Penelope thought about how far they had come from that dusty day in June, when she had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a broken heart and borrowed hope. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not been there that day?" Penelope asked. "If you had not torn up Theodore's letter and written me that promise?" "All the time," Caleb admitted. "But then I remind myself that I was there. I did tear it up. I did make you that promise. And you trusted me enough to accept it. Everything that came after we built together. No regrets, not a single one," Caleb said, pulling her close. "You are the best decision I ever made, Penelope Vance, the best promise I ever kept." They sat there until the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had stood the test of time. The years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. Morrison and his wife had 4 children in total, 3 boys and a girl, all of them horse-mad like their father. Emma and her husband had twins, a boy and a girl, who showed early signs of inheriting their mother's head for business and their father's love of books. Caleb's hair turned fully silver, but he remained strong and active, still working the ranch every day even as Morrison took on more and more of the physical labor. Penelope's hands grew gnarled with arthritis, making sewing difficult, but she adapted, finding new ways to contribute and staying involved in the Women's Assistance Fund that had become her passion. Sarah lived to be 78, passing peacefully in her sleep at the boarding house she had run for over 40 years. Her death hit both Penelope and Caleb hard, removing a cornerstone of their lives. But they honored her memory by continuing the work she had started, ensuring that the boarding house remained a safe haven for those who needed it. On quiet evenings, when the grandchildren had gone home and the ranch was settling in for the night, Penelope and Caleb would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the hills. Sometimes they talked, sharing memories and making plans for the future. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, content in the knowledge that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Penelope kept Caleb's original promise in her jewelry box, the paper now yellowed and brittle with age. She took it out sometimes and read the words he had written that first day, marveling at how something so simple had changed the course of her entire life. "I promise Miss Penelope Ashworth a place to stay for as long as she needs it. No expectations, no obligations. Just a chance to figure out what comes next." He had given her so much more than that. He had given her a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that had sustained her through every challenge life threw their way. He had shown her what it meant to make a promise and keep it, day after day, year after year, through good times and bad. As they grew older still, their children and grandchildren worried about them living alone on the ranch, suggesting they move into town where help would be closer. But Penelope and Caleb refused, unwilling to leave the place where they had built their life together. The ranch was in their bones, as much a part of them as each other. Morrison and Emma took turns staying with them, ensuring they were never truly alone. The grandchildren visited constantly, filling the house with noise and laughter and the chaos of youth. It was everything Penelope had never dared to dream of during those dark days in Boston, when she had felt so alone and unwanted. On a warm afternoon in late spring, when Penelope was 73 and Caleb was 75, they sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The valley spread out before them, green and gold in the afternoon light, dotted with horses and cattle that bore the Vance brand. "You remember the day we met?" Penelope asked, though she knew he did. They had told the story so many times to their children and grandchildren that it had taken on the quality of legend in the family. "Every detail," Caleb said. "You stepped off that stagecoach looking like you were ready to take on the world despite having just had your heart broken. I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change. You tore up Theodore's letter before you even knew my name. Because I knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of broken promises," Caleb said, "and I knew I could not just stand there and let you suffer alone." "That promise you wrote me," Penelope said softly, "you have kept it every single day since." "And I will keep it every day I have left," Caleb said, bringing her hand to his lips. "You will always have a place with me, Penelope. Always." They sat together as the sun tracked across the sky, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something extraordinary from it. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, the legacy they would leave behind for their children and their children's children. That evening, Emma came to make them dinner, bringing her husband and the twins. Morrison arrived shortly after with his youngest son, who wanted to show his grandfather a new trick he had taught his horse. The house filled with family and food and conversation, the kind of comfortable chaos that Penelope had learned to love over the years. Later, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, Penelope and Caleb went to bed in the room they had shared for over 50 years. Caleb pulled her close, her head resting on his shoulder as it had done countless times before. "I love you," he said, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I love you too," Penelope replied. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after that." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and neither could have asked for anything more. The years that remained to them were precious, each day a gift they did not take for granted. They saw Morrison's oldest grandson get married, witnessed Emma's daughter graduate from a teaching college in San Francisco, held great-grandchildren who bore their features and their names. The ranch continued to thrive under Morrison's management, and the Women's Assistance Fund helped its 100th woman start a new life in Colombia. When Caleb finally passed at the age of 82, surrounded by his family in the bed where all his children had been born, Penelope held his hand and whispered promises of her own. She promised to keep his memory alive, to care for the ranch and the family they had built together, to live fully for whatever time she had left. True to her word, Penelope lived for another 3 years, remaining active and engaged despite the grief that never quite left her. She spent her days with her children and grandchildren, passing down family stories and skills, ensuring that Caleb's legacy lived on in more than just the ranch that bore his name. She took the promise he had written her that first day and had it framed, hanging it in the main room of the ranch house where everyone could see it. Beside it, she hung the promise she had written after his death, her own words mirroring his from so long ago. "I promise Caleb Vance that his love will never be forgotten, that his kindness will inspire generations, and that the life we built together will stand as proof that true promises are always kept." When her time came, Penelope went peacefully, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch with a quilt over her lap and the valley spread out before her. She was found by Emma, who had stopped by for their usual afternoon tea, a slight smile on her face as though she were greeting an old friend. They buried her beside Caleb on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a spreading oak tree where they had often picnicked with their children. The entire town of Columbia turned out for the funeral, along with dozens of women who had been helped by the Assistance Fund over the years. Each had a story about how Penelope's kindness had changed their lives, giving them hope when they had none. Morrison and Emma stood together at the graveside. Their children and grandchildren gathered around them and told the story one more time. The story of how their mother had arrived in Colombia with a letter of rejection and a broken heart, and how their father had torn up that letter and written her a promise instead. How that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that had lasted a lifetime and built a legacy that would endure for generations. The ranch remained in the family, passing down through Morrison's line while Emma's children managed the business side. The Women's Assistance Fund continued to operate, eventually growing large enough to help women throughout California find safety and new beginnings. And the promise that Caleb had written, carefully preserved in its frame, remained hanging in the ranch house, a reminder to every generation that came after of the power of keeping your word. In Columbia, California, they still tell the story of Penelope Ashworth and Caleb Vance, of how a broken promise led to a kept one, and how love can bloom in the most unexpected places when watered by kindness and tended with care. It has become part of the town's history, a tale told to children and grandchildren about the importance of integrity, compassion, and the courage to help someone in need. The boarding house where Penelope first stayed still stands, now a historical landmark that houses a small museum dedicated to the women who helped settle the West. In it, visitors can see letters and photographs, quilts and dresses, artifacts of lives lived with courage and determination. And in a place of honor, they can see a copy of that first promise, the words that started it all. I promise Miss Penelope Ashworth a place to stay for as long as she needs it. No expectations, no obligations, just a chance to figure out what comes next. Signed, Caleb Vance. Beside it hangs Penelope's response, written years later but no less powerful. I promise Caleb Vance that his love will never be forgotten, that his kindness will inspire generations, and that the life we built together will stand as proof that true promises are always kept. Signed, Penelope Vance. The promises hang side by side, yellowed with age but still clear, still powerful, still speaking to the truth that sometimes the best things in life come not from grand gestures or flowery words, but from simple acts of kindness offered without expectation of return. And in the valley outside Columbia, where the Vance Ranch still operates after more than a century and a half, horses still run in the pastures and children still learn the value of hard work and kept promises. The oak tree on the hill has grown massive, its branches spreading wide to shade the graves of Caleb and Penelope Vance, together in death as they were in life. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slants golden across the hills, visitors to the ranch swear they can see two figures sitting beneath that oak tree, hands clasped, watching the sun set over the land they loved. Whether it is truth or simply the power of a story well told, it does not really matter. What matters is the legacy they left behind, proof that love built on honesty, kindness, and kept promises can endure anything time throws at it. Their story lives on, passed down through generations of Vances and through the countless women whose lives were changed by Penelope's assistance fund. It lives on in the town of Columbia itself, in the Historical Society's records, and the stories told around dinner tables. It lives on wherever someone needs to be reminded that broken promises do not have to define us, that second chances do exist, and that sometimes the greatest love stories start with the smallest acts of kindness. Penelope Ashworth arrived in Columbia, California in June of 1872, with nothing but 2 trunks and a letter of rejection. She left this world 85 years later, having built a life rich in love, family, and purpose. And it all started because a cowboy named Caleb Vance saw someone in need and chose to help, tearing up the rejection letter that could have defined her and writing instead a promise that would change both their lives forever. In the end, that is the real power of the story. Not the romance, though that is certainly part of it. Not the success of the ranch or the assistance fund, though those are important too. The real power lies in the reminder that we all have the ability to change someone's life with a simple act of kindness. We all have the power to see someone who is hurting and offer help without expectation. We all have the ability to tear up the rejections and write promises instead. Caleb Vance understood that, and he lived it every day of his life. Penelope Ashworth learned it, and she passed it on to everyone she touched. Together, they built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes, a legacy of love and kindness that continues to inspire everyone who hears their story. And that, more than anything else, is why their tale endures. Because in a world that often feels harsh and unforgiving, where broken promises seem to outnumber kept ones, The story of Penelope and Caleb reminds us that things can be different, that love can triumph over rejection, that kindness can change everything, and that promises, when made with a sincere heart, have the power to build something beautiful and lasting. The stagecoach no longer runs to Columbia. The Silver Creek Saloon is long gone, replaced by modern buildings that would be unrecognizable to Penelope and Caleb. But the story remains, as fresh and powerful as the day it happened, a testament to the enduring power of love, kindness, and promises kept.